My son-in-law Kevin laughed in my face and called me a, quote, useless old relic who contributes nothing, before taking my daughter on a month-long European vacation with my late husband's money. But what they didn't know was that while they were sipping champagne in Paris, I was quietly executing the biggest business deal of my life. One that would make them both come crawling back, begging for forgiveness they'd never receive. Before I tell you how I turned the tables on my greedy family, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Also, drop a comment telling me about a time someone completely underestimated your abilities because of your age or appearance. Your stories inspire these videos, and I read every single comment. My name is Margaret Elena Castellano, but everyone calls me Elena. I'm 70 years old, and I live in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street in Riverside, Illinois. The same house where my late husband Roberto and I raised our daughter Christina for 35 years. From the outside, I probably look exactly like what you'd expect from a widow my age. I drive a 12-year-old Honda Civic, I shop with coupons, I wear the same winter coat I bought 15 years ago, and I spend most of my time tending to my garden or reading mystery novels on my front porch. If you saw me at the grocery store, you might think I was just another elderly woman counting pennies and living on Social Security. You'd probably feel a little sorry for me, this gray-haired grandmother shuffling through the produce section, taking forever to decide between the regular tomatoes and the ones on sale. You might even offer to help me reach something on a high shelf, and I'd smile gratefully, and thank you for your kindness. And that's exactly what my family thought they knew about me. They had no idea that the helpless old woman they dismissed so casually had been quietly building an empire while they weren't paying attention. They saw my frugal habits and assumed poverty. They saw my quiet demeanor and assumed weakness. They saw my age and assumed irrelevance. They couldn't have been more wrong about any of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how Kevin's cruelty became the catalyst for the most satisfying revenge of my life, you need to know the whole story. You need to understand who I really am, what I've been hiding for decades, and why the people closest to me never bothered to look beyond the surface of the woman they thought they could manipulate and dismiss. My story begins 45 years ago when I was a 25-year-old newlywed who spoke broken English and had nothing but hope and determination. Roberto and I had immigrated from a small village outside Naples, Italy, with 2 suitcases and a dream of building something meaningful in America. Roberto was a gifted carpenter who could work magic with wood, but he struggled with the business side of things. His English was limited, he was too trusting with customers, and he had no head for numbers or contracts. That's where I came in. While Roberto built beautiful custom furniture in our garage, I taught myself English by watching soap operas and reading newspapers. I learned about American business practices by studying every contract, every invoice, every interaction we had with suppliers and customers. When customers tried to shortchange us because we were foreign, I learned to negotiate. When suppliers tried to overcharge us because they thought we didn't know better, I learned to shop around and demand fair prices. Within 5 years, Roberto's one-man carpentry operation had grown into Castellano Custom Woodworks, with a workshop, 3 employees, and a waiting list of customers who appreciated quality craftsmanship. But what nobody knew, not even Roberto, was that I'd been quietly investing every extra dollar we made. While my neighbors thought I was just the carpenter's wife who helped with the books, I was actually studying the stock market with the intensity of a Wall Street analyst. I read every financial magazine I could get my hands on. I attended free investment seminars at the library. I started with tiny investments, $50 here, $100 there, learning from every gain and every loss. Roberto knew I managed our business finances, but he had no idea that I was also managing a growing portfolio of investments that would eventually dwarf everything we made from the woodworking business. He was content to focus on his craft while I handled everything else, and I was careful to keep my investment activities separate from our day-to-day operations. By the time Christina was born in 1979, I had already built our investment portfolio to over $50,000, money that Roberto didn't even know existed. While I was changing diapers and running the business, I was also buying and selling stocks, reinvesting dividends, and slowly but steadily building wealth that would ensure our daughter's future. Christina grew up thinking her mother was just a housewife who helped Dad with his business. She never knew that the woman who packed her lunch every morning and helped with her homework every night was also the architect of the family's financial security. Roberto and I lived modestly, drove older cars, and saved every penny we could. Not because we had to, but because I believed in building something that would last. When Roberto died of a heart attack 12 years ago, Christina was devastated, and I was heartbroken. But I was also prepared in ways that neither of us had fully understood. The woodworking business had been profitable, but my investments had grown to over $2 million. Money that I'd been managing successfully for decades while appearing to be nothing more than a supportive wife and mother. Even then, I didn't tell Christina about the full extent of our wealth. She inherited Roberto's tools and his workshop, which she immediately sold because she had no interest in continuing the business. She used that money as a down payment on a house in the suburbs with her new husband, Kevin, whom she'd married just 6 months before her father's death. Kevin Martinez seemed like a decent man at first. He was handsome, charming, and he treated Christina like a princess during their courtship. He had a good job in sales at a car dealership, drove a flashy BMW, and always picked up the check when we went out to dinner. Christina was completely smitten, and Roberto and I were happy that she'd found someone who made her smile. But Roberto died before Kevin's true nature emerged, and I started seeing warning signs that my grieving daughter was too distracted to notice. The first red flag was Kevin's attitude toward money and work. He bragged constantly about his sales commissions and expensive purchases, but he also complained frequently about how hard he had to work for everything. He seemed to believe that life owed him luxury and comfort without effort, and he was always looking for shortcuts and easy opportunities. The second red flag was how he talked about elderly people in general, and about me specifically. He'd make jokes about old folks being out of touch and useless. He'd roll his eyes when I shared stories about Roberto, or offered advice based on my experiences. He treated my opinions like outdated nonsense from someone who couldn't possibly understand the modern world. But the biggest red flag was how quickly he became interested in my finances after Roberto's death. Within months of the funeral, Kevin was asking Christina pointed questions about what I'd inherited, how much the house was worth, and whether I was managing okay on my own. He'd make comments about how difficult it must be for an elderly widow to handle complex financial decisions, and he'd offer to help me organize my affairs. Christina, bless her heart, was trying to be supportive during our shared grief, so she started including Kevin in family discussions about my well-being. Before I knew it, he was suggesting that I might need assistance with bill paying, investment management, and long-term planning. He presented himself as the concerned son-in-law who just wanted to make sure his wife's mother was taken care of properly. I politely declined his offers, explaining that I was managing fine on my own. But Kevin was persistent in that particularly annoying way that some people have. He'd bring up my financial vulnerability at every family gathering, always with a concerned expression and a tone that suggested he was doing me a favor by worrying about me. What Kevin didn't understand was that I'd been successfully managing complex financial affairs since before he was born. While he was learning to walk, I was learning to read stock reports. While he was playing video games, I was building wealth through careful investments and strategic planning. The helpless widow he saw was actually a seasoned investor, with decades of experience and millions of dollars in assets. But I let him continue believing that I was just a confused old woman who needed guidance. There's something powerful about being underestimated. It gives you an enormous advantage when dealing with people who think they're smarter than you are. Kevin's condescending attitude toward me was revealing more about his character than he realized, and I was taking careful note of everything. As Christina and Kevin's marriage progressed, I watched their dynamic with growing concern. Kevin was controlling about money, dismissive of Christina's opinions, and increasingly demanding about their lifestyle. He wanted expensive vacations, a bigger house, a more luxurious car, but he also wanted Christina to quit her job as a nurse so she could focus on their family, even though they didn't have children yet. Christina, who had always been somewhat naive about financial matters, was beginning to struggle under the pressure of Kevin's expectations. Her salary as a registered nurse was good, but not good enough to support the lifestyle Kevin wanted to maintain. They were accumulating credit card debt, and I could see the stress beginning to affect their relationship. That's when Kevin's interest in my finances became more aggressive. About 3 years after Roberto's death, Kevin started making specific suggestions about how I could better utilize my resources. He'd read articles about reverse mortgages and life insurance policies, and he'd share this information with me like he was providing some kind of valuable financial education. He talked about how elderly people needed to be strategic about their assets to ensure they didn't become burdens on their families. The subtext was clear. Kevin thought I was sitting on valuable assets that could be accessed to improve his and Christina's financial situation. He assumed that my house was my primary asset, and that I was probably struggling to maintain it on a fixed income. He had no idea that the house was completely paid off, or that my, quote, fixed income included substantial returns from a diversified investment portfolio worth millions. I started testing Kevin's character in small ways. I'd mention minor home repairs that needed to be done, and he'd immediately suggest that I might want to consider selling the house rather than spending money on maintenance. When I talked about wanting to travel to Italy to visit distant relatives, he'd explain how expensive international travel was for someone on a, quote, limited budget like mine. Everything Kevin said revealed his fundamental assumption that I was poor, helpless, and in need of management by younger, smarter people like himself. He never asked about my actual financial situation. He simply assumed he understood it based on my age and apparent lifestyle. But the real turning point came last Christmas, during what should have been a peaceful family celebration. Christina and Kevin came to my house for Christmas dinner, as they had every year since Roberto's death. I'd spent days preparing all of Roberto's favorite recipes, decorating the house the way we always had, and creating the kind of warm, family atmosphere that had been the foundation of our holiday traditions for decades. Everything was going well until Kevin started drinking wine and sharing his opinions about my life choices. He began by criticizing my old-fashioned decorations, then moved on to questioning my wasteful spending on expensive ingredients for dinner. By the time we got to dessert, he was lecturing me about the reality of my financial situation. Elena, he said, using that patronizing tone that I'd learned to recognize as his signal that he was about to say something insulting while pretending to be helpful. Christina and I have been talking, and we're really concerned about how you're managing your money. You're spending like you're still married to a working man, but the reality is that you're an elderly widow on a fixed income. Christina looked uncomfortable but said nothing, which hurt almost as much as Kevin's words. This was the daughter I'd raised, the child I'd sacrificed for, the woman whose education I'd funded and whose wedding I'd helped pay for, and she was sitting silently while her husband explained to me why I was too old and stupid to manage my own life. You need to be realistic about your limitations, Kevin continued, warming up to his subject. This house is way too big for you, the maintenance costs are probably eating up most of your income, and you're not getting any younger. Christina and I think it's time to start making some practical decisions about your future. I asked him what kind of practical decisions he had in mind. Well, for starters, you should sell this place and move into a nice senior community where you don't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep. You could use the proceeds from the house sale to fund your care, and anything left over could be set aside for emergencies or to help Christina and me get into a bigger place so we'd have room for you to visit. There it was, Kevin's master plan. Sell my house, move me into institutional care, and use the proceeds to upgrade his lifestyle while making himself look like the dutiful son-in-law who is taking care of his wife's elderly mother. But he wasn't done. The other thing you need to think about, he said, pouring himself another glass of wine, is estate planning. You don't want to leave Christina with a bunch of complicated financial decisions when something happens to you. It would be much better to simplify everything now, while you're still mentally sharp enough to make good choices. I asked him what he meant by simplifying. Transfer your assets to Christina now so she can manage them properly. Set up a trust or something that ensures you're taken care of, but gives her the authority to make financial decisions. That way, if you start to decline mentally, and, let's face it, it happens to everyone eventually, Christina won't have to go through the nightmare of probate courts and guardianship proceedings. Kevin had just outlined a plan to strip me of my autonomy, take control of my assets, and warehouse me in an institution, all while presenting himself as the wise, caring family member who was protecting everyone's interests. And Christina said nothing. I looked at my daughter, the child I'd loved and nurtured and sacrificed for, waiting for her to defend me or at least question Kevin's assumptions about my capabilities. Instead, she was staring at her plate, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge her husband's assessment of my situation. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where my daughter's loyalties lay, and it broke something inside me that I didn't know could be broken. I excused myself from the table, went to the kitchen, and stood there for a few minutes trying to process what had just happened. My son-in-law had basically called me too old and stupid to manage my own life, and my daughter had tacitly agreed with him by refusing to speak up in my defense. When I returned to the dining room, Kevin was still talking, now sharing his opinions about how elderly people needed to accept their limitations and stop trying to maintain independence that was really just stubborn pride. The thing is, Elena, he said, people your age have trouble admitting when they need help. You think you're still the same person you were 20 years ago, but the reality is that you're not. Your judgment isn't as sharp, your memory isn't as reliable, and your ability to handle complex decisions is naturally declining. That's not your fault. It's just biology. But it means you need to start letting younger people make the important decisions. Single quote. I sat there listening to this man who had never shown any interest in understanding who I really was or what I was capable of, and I realized that he genuinely believed every word he was saying. Kevin wasn't trying to manipulate me. He actually thought he was giving me valuable advice based on his superior understanding of my limitations. That's when something crystallized for me. Kevin wasn't just greedy or controlling. He was fundamentally incapable of seeing me as anything other than a stereotype. To him, I wasn't Margaret Elena Castellano, successful businesswoman and seasoned investor. I was just elderly widow, a category of person he understood to be helpless, confused, and in need of management by people like himself. And Christina, by her silence, was revealing that she saw me the same way. I decided that night that it was time for my family to learn exactly who they'd been underestimating. But I also decided that they would learn this lesson entirely on my terms, in my timing, and in the most shocking way possible. What happened next would exceed even my own expectations for how satisfying revenge could be when it was planned and executed by someone with the resources, intelligence, and motivation to do it right. But first, Kevin and Christina were about to hand me the perfect opportunity to show them exactly what this, quote, useless old relic was capable of accomplishing while they were off spending money they hadn't earned on a vacation they didn't deserve. The weeks following that disastrous Christmas dinner were some of the most eye-opening of my life, not because I learned anything new about myself, but because I finally saw my family with complete clarity. The illusions I'd been maintaining about their love and respect for me crumbled away, leaving behind the stark reality of how they actually viewed me and what they actually wanted from me. Kevin's behavior became more aggressive and persistent after the holidays, as if our Christmas conversation had given him permission to openly discuss my, quote, limitations and his solutions for them. He started calling me every few days with new articles he'd found about senior living communities, reverse mortgages, and estate planning strategies. Each conversation followed the same pattern. He'd present himself as the helpful son-in-law doing research for my benefit, while making it clear that my current lifestyle was unsustainable and irresponsible. But what really stung was Christina's transformation. My daughter, who had once called me every day just to chat, now only contacted me when Kevin prompted her to check on my situation. Our conversations became stilted and formal, focused on practical concerns rather than the easy intimacy we'd shared for decades. She'd ask pointed questions about my bills, my health, my daily activities, not out of genuine interest, but as if she were gathering information for some kind of assessment. I realized that Kevin had convinced Christina that I was declining mentally and financially, and that they needed to monitor me carefully for signs of incompetence or crisis. They weren't calling because they missed me or wanted to share their lives with me. They were calling because they thought I was becoming a problem that required management. This revelation hurt more than Kevin's obvious greed and manipulation. Christina was my only child, the daughter I'd raised with infinite love and patience, the young woman I'd supported through every challenge and celebrated through every success. The idea that she now saw me as a burden rather than a person was almost unbearable, but it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For years, I'd been careful to maintain the image of the modest, frugal widow who needed family support and guidance. I downplayed my capabilities and hidden my achievements because I thought it was more important to preserve family harmony than to assert my independence. I'd let Kevin condescend to me and Christina ignore me, because I believed that keeping the peace was worth more than demanding respect. Now I understood that this approach had been a mistake. By allowing them to underestimate me, I'd actually enabled their disrespect and encouraged their manipulation. They didn't see my modesty as humility. They saw it as weakness. They didn't appreciate my frugality as wisdom, they interpreted it as poverty. They didn't value my quiet strength, they mistook it for helplessness. It was time for that to change. The opportunity came in February, when Kevin called with what he clearly thought was exciting news. "Elena, I have incredible information for you," he said, his voice buzzing with the fake enthusiasm he used when he thought he was doing me a favor. "Christina and I have been talking to a financial advisor, and we've found the perfect solution for your situation." I asked him what solution he was referring to. "We found this amazing senior living community called Sunset Gardens. It's only about 20 minutes from our house, so we could visit you all the time, and they have everything you need. Meal service, housekeeping, activities, even transportation for medical appointments. You wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore." Kevin went on to explain that Sunset Gardens was, quote, surprisingly affordable at only $3,800 per month, especially considering all the services included. He'd already spoken to their admissions coordinator and learned that they had immediate availability in their assisted living section. "The best part," he continued, "is that they have a streamlined financial process. You can use the proceeds from selling your house to fund your residency, and their financial team can help manage everything for you. They even have partnerships with estate planning attorneys who can help you organize your assets properly." I listened to Kevin's pitch with growing amazement. He'd essentially planned my entire future without consulting me, researched facilities and financing options without my knowledge, and was now presenting his conclusions as if I should be grateful for his initiative. But he wasn't finished. "Christina and I have been thinking, and we know this is a big change for you. So we want to do something special to help you adjust to the idea. We've decided to take you on a really nice vacation before you move to Sunset Gardens. A month in Europe, Italy, France, maybe Spain. We can visit all those places you're always talking about from the old country." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Kevin was offering me a month-long European vacation, not as a gift but as a bribe to accept his plan for dismantling my independence. He wanted me to be so grateful for his generosity that I'd agree to sell my house and move into institutional care without questioning his motives. But the most revealing part of his proposal was the timeline he suggested. "We're thinking we could leave in early March and be gone for about 4 weeks," he said. "That would give you time to really relax and enjoy yourself while Christina and I handle all the paperwork and arrangements for your move. We could list the house, meet with the estate planning attorney, even start packing some of your things. By the time we get back, everything would be ready for a smooth transition." Kevin wanted me out of the country for a month so he and Christina could sell my house and arrange my institutionalization without my interference. He was planning to present me with a fait accompli when we returned. Signed contracts, moving dates, financial arrangements, all completed in my absence. The audacity was breathtaking. Kevin genuinely believed that a month-long vacation would be sufficient payment for my compliance with his plan to control my life and assets. He thought a trip to Europe would make me so grateful that I'd happily surrender my autonomy and let him manage my affairs. I told Kevin that his proposal sounded very generous, and that I'd need some time to think it over. "Of course, take all the time you need," he said magnanimously, "but don't take too long, because we need to book flights and hotels pretty soon if we want to get good prices." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing what had just happened. My son-in-law had just offered to take me on an expensive vacation, as payment for giving up my independence and allowing him to control my assets. And he clearly expected me to be grateful for this opportunity. That night, I called my financial advisor, James Morrison, whom I'd been working with for over 15 years. James was one of the few people who knew the true extent of my wealth, and he'd been helping me manage my investments with the discretion and expertise that had allowed me to build substantial assets while maintaining a modest public profile. "Elena, it's good to hear from you," James said when I reached him at home. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, James, but I need your advice about something. My family is pressuring me to sell my house and move into assisted living, and I think they're planning to take control of my finances." James was quiet for a moment. "Elena, you're one of my most financially sophisticated clients. You've been successfully managing complex investments for decades. What possible justification could they have for questioning your competence? They don't know about my investments, I explained. They think I'm living on Social Security and struggling to maintain my house. They see me as a confused elderly widow who needs their guidance and protection. How much do they think you're worth? They think my house is my only asset, and they assume I'm having trouble affording basic maintenance and expenses. James laughed, but not unkindly. Elena, your investment portfolio is worth over $3.8 million. Your house is completely paid off and probably worth $400,000 in the current market. You have more financial security than most people dream of. What exactly do they think they're protecting you from? Themselves, apparently, I said. They want to sell my house, put me in assisted living, and use the proceeds to fund my care while they manage my assets. And they don't know about the investments? They have no idea, they've never asked about my finances, and I've never volunteered the information. They've simply assumed that what they see is all there is. James was quiet again, and I could hear him thinking, Elena, what do you want to do about this? I want to teach them a lesson they'll never forget, I said. But I also want to make sure they can never try to manipulate me again. What did you have in mind? I explained Kevin's vacation proposal and his obvious plan to arrange my affairs while I was out of the country. James, what if I let them take me on this vacation, but instead of being their passive victim, I used the time to make some moves of my own? What kind of moves? The kind that would shock them when we get back. The kind that would prove once and for all that they've been completely wrong about who they're dealing with. James understood immediately. Elena, are you thinking about making some major changes to your investment strategy? I'm thinking about making some major changes to everything. My investments, my estate planning, my living situation, my relationship with my family, all of it. That's a significant undertaking. Are you sure you want to take such drastic steps? James, they're planning to have me declared incompetent and steal my assets. I think drastic steps are entirely appropriate. We spent the next hour discussing strategies that would not only protect my wealth from Kevin's manipulation, but would also position me to make decisions about my legacy that reflected my values rather than my family's greed. By the end of our conversation, I had the beginnings of a plan that would transform Kevin's attempted manipulation into the foundation for my complete independence and his total humiliation. The next morning, I called Kevin back. I've thought about your vacation proposal, I told him, and I think it sounds wonderful. When did you want to leave? Kevin's excitement was audible. Elena, that's fantastic. We were thinking March 15th for about 4 weeks. Does that work for you? That sounds perfect, I said. I'll start getting my documents organized so you can handle things while we're gone. Don't worry about any of that, Kevin said quickly. Christina and I will take care of everything. You just focus on enjoying yourself and getting ready for your new adventure. Your new adventure? Kevin couldn't even pretend that this vacation was about my enjoyment. It was about preparing me for the adventure of giving up my independence and letting him control my life. But Kevin had no idea what kind of adventure I was actually planning. Over the next few weeks, I began putting my real plan into motion. While Kevin and Christina made travel arrangements and researched senior living facilities, I was working with James to restructure my entire financial portfolio and establish new investment vehicles that would give me even more control and flexibility. I also began documenting everything, every conversation with Kevin about my limitations, every suggestion Christina made about my need for help, every assumption they made about my financial situation, every plan they discussed for managing my affairs. I was building a comprehensive record of their manipulation and their complete ignorance of my actual capabilities. But most importantly, I was preparing to make a series of business moves that would shock everyone who thought they knew me. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came in the form of a phone call from my old friend Maria Santos, whose family had run a successful restaurant business in Chicago for 3 generations. Maria and I had known each other since our children were small, and she'd often consulted me about business decisions over the years, though she didn't know the full extent of my investment experience. Elena, Maria said when she called in early March, I need your advice about something important. My nephew Tony has an opportunity to buy a small chain of restaurants, but he needs investors. I know you're good with money, and I wondered if you might know anyone who could help. Maria explained that Tony Santos had found 3 struggling Italian restaurants in prime Chicago locations that could be purchased as a package deal for $2.5 million. The restaurants had good bones but poor management, and Tony was confident he could turn them around with the right investment and strategy. The problem is, Maria continued, Tony only has access to about half the money he needs. He's looking for an investor who could provide the other half in exchange for a partnership in the business. I asked Maria to tell me more about Tony's experience and his plans for the restaurants. Tony's been in the restaurant business his whole life, she explained. He managed our family restaurant for 10 years before starting his own place 5 years ago. He's smart, he's hardworking, and he understands both the creative and business sides of running restaurants. But he doesn't have the kind of money it takes to buy multiple properties. As Maria described the opportunity, I realized that this could be exactly what I needed. A legitimate business investment that would demonstrate my financial sophistication while creating a new source of income and a public role that would shock my family when they discovered it. Maria, I said, I might be interested in this opportunity myself. You, Elena? I thought you were. Do you have that kind of money? I might. Can you arrange for me to meet with Tony and review his business plan? Of course, but Elena, are you sure about this? It's a lot of money, and restaurant businesses can be risky. Maria, I've been making investment decisions for longer than you might realize. If Tony's plan is solid, I'm definitely interested. 2 days later, I met with Tony Santos at his current restaurant, a cozy Italian place in Little Italy that was bustling with customers even on a Tuesday afternoon. Tony was a serious, articulate man in his 40s, who clearly knew his business inside and out. His proposal was impressive. Purchase 3 underperforming restaurants in excellent locations, rebrand them as upscale casual Italian dining, and implement proven systems for operations, marketing, and financial management. Mrs. Castellano, Tony said after presenting his detailed business plan, I need an investor who understands that this isn't just about money. I need someone who shares my vision for what these restaurants could become and who's willing to be involved in major decisions about the business. What kind of involvement are you talking about? I asked. Well, ideally, my investor would take an active role in the company. Maybe serve as president or CEO, while I focus on operations and expansion. Someone with business experience who could handle the financial and strategic planning while I concentrate on the restaurant side. I looked at Tony's projections, his market analysis, his operational plans, and his financial requirements. Everything looked solid, well-researched, and realistic. More importantly, Tony was offering me the chance to become the CEO of a multi-million-dollar restaurant company. Exactly the kind of high-profile role that would demonstrate my capabilities in the most public way possible. Tony, I said, I'm very interested in this opportunity. Let me review everything with my financial advisor, and I'll get back to you within a week. Really? Mrs. Castellano, I have to admit, I wasn't expecting someone like you to be interested in this kind of investment. What do you mean, someone like me? Tony looked embarrassed. I just meant, well, you seem very nice, but this is a big, complex business deal. Most people your age prefer safer investments. Even Tony, who was trying to be respectful, couldn't imagine that a 70-year-old woman might be capable of understanding and managing a sophisticated business investment. The assumptions were so ingrained that even people who should have known better couldn't see past them. Quote, Tony, I said with a smile, I think you're going to be very surprised by what people my age are capable of when we put our minds to it. That afternoon, I met with James to discuss the restaurant investment and how it could fit into my larger strategy for shocking my family. Elena, this is a legitimate business opportunity with good potential returns, James said after reviewing Tony's proposal. But are you sure you want to make such a dramatic move right now? Becoming the CEO of a restaurant company is a big step. James, Kevin and Christina think I'm too incompetent to manage my own household finances. They're planning to sell my house and put me in assisted living because they believe I can't handle the complexity of independent living. What do you think they'll say when they discover that I've become the chief executive of a multi-million-dollar company? I think they'll be shocked beyond belief. Exactly, and James, there's something else I want to do while they're busy planning my institutionalization. What's that? I want to buy a penthouse. James stared at me. A penthouse? Kevin thinks I need to sell my house because it's too big and expensive for me to maintain. I want to show him what I consider appropriate housing for someone with my resources and capabilities. Over the next week, while Kevin and Christina finalized our travel plans and researched assisted living facilities, I was busy making the biggest financial moves of my life. I met with Tony Santos 3 more times, reviewed every aspect of his business plan with my team of advisors, and negotiated a partnership agreement that would make me the majority owner and CEO of Santos Restaurant Group. I also began working with a high-end real estate agent to find a luxury penthouse that would serve as both my new home and a dramatic statement about my true financial situation. The penthouse I found was everything Kevin's assumptions about my poverty were not. A 3,000-square-foot corner unit on the 42nd floor of a prestigious downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, a library, and enough space to entertain 50 people comfortably. The price was $2.8 million, about 7 times what Kevin thought my house was worth. Quote, "Elena, my real estate agent said when I expressed serious interest, this is obviously a significant purchase. Do you need time to arrange financing?" "Number financing necessary," I told her. "I'll pay cash." By March 10th, 5 days before our departure for Europe, I had signed contracts to purchase both the restaurant business and the penthouse. I was about to become the CEO of Santos Restaurant Group and the owner of one of Chicago's most exclusive residential addresses. But Kevin and Christina knew nothing about any of this. As far as they were concerned, I was just the confused elderly widow who was finally accepting their guidance about my need for institutional care. They thought our month in Europe would be my last taste of independence before they transitioned me into the manageable, controllable living situation they'd planned for me. They had no idea that while they were congratulating themselves on their clever manipulation, I was orchestrating business deals that would make me wealthier and more powerful than they could imagine. The night before our departure, Kevin called to go over the final travel arrangements. "Elena, I want you to know how excited Christina and I are about this trip," he said. "We think this vacation is going to be perfect for helping you adjust to the changes that are coming." "I'm sure it will be very educational," I agreed. "And don't worry about anything here at home. Christina and I will take care of everything while you're gone. When we get back, your whole life is going to be so much easier and more comfortable." "Kevin," I said, "I think this trip is going to change everything for all of us." "Absolutely. This is going to be the start of a whole new chapter in your life." Kevin had no idea how right he was about that. As I packed my suitcase for what Kevin thought was my farewell tour of independence, I was actually preparing for the most satisfying month of my entire life. While Kevin and Christina spent the next 4 weeks planning my future, I would be building an empire that would shock them beyond their wildest imagination. By the time we returned from Europe, I wouldn't just be Elena Castellano, the helpless widow they thought they could manipulate and control. I would be Elena Castellano, CEO of Santos Restaurant Group, owner of a multi-million-dollar penthouse, and the woman who was about to teach them the most expensive lesson in respect they would ever receive. Quote, "But first, I had to endure 4 weeks of being treated like an invalid, while secretly executing the biggest business deals of my life." The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. The flight to Rome was everything I'd expected it would be. Kevin treating me like a fragile, elderly tourist who needed constant supervision, Christina acting like my reluctant caretaker, and me playing the role of the grateful grandmother, while secretly managing a multi-million-dollar business acquisition from 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. Kevin had booked us first-class seats, which should have been my first clue about how much money he was planning to spend on this manipulation campaign. As we settled into our leather seats with champagne and warm towels, Kevin kept making comments about how this was probably the most luxurious travel experience I'd ever had. "Elena, isn't this incredible?" he said, gesturing around the spacious cabin. "I bet you never imagined you'd be flying first class to Europe at your age." I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the overwhelmed elderly woman who was grateful for her son-in-law's generosity. But what Kevin didn't realize was that I'd flown first class to Europe multiple times over the years, usually for investment conferences or business meetings that he never knew about. The luxury wasn't new to me, but his condescending attitude about it was revealing. "This must be costing you a fortune," I said, probing to understand how Kevin was funding this expensive vacation. "Don't worry about the cost," Kevin replied smoothly. "Christina and I have been saving for this trip for months. We wanted to do something really special for you before you transition to your new living situation. Christina shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. I watched her carefully, trying to understand whether she was complicit in Kevin's plans or just going along to avoid conflict. Either way, her silence was becoming increasingly painful. As our plane lifted off from Chicago, I discreetly pulled out my phone and sent a text message to James Morrison. Closing day moved up. Finalize everything by March 20th. We'll call from Rome with details. Kevin noticed me using my phone and immediately became protective. Elena, you don't need to worry about anything back home. Just focus on enjoying this trip. I was just letting my neighbor know I arrived safely, I lied smoothly. That's very thoughtful, but really, you should try to disconnect from all that routine stuff. This vacation is about relaxation and new experiences. Single quote. Kevin wanted me disconnected from my routine stuff because he was planning to disrupt all of it while I was gone. But what he didn't know was that my quote included managing a sophisticated investment portfolio and executing complex business transactions. Disconnecting from that would cost me millions of dollars and the opportunity to shock him beyond belief. Our first week in Italy was a masterclass in condescension disguised as care. Kevin appointed himself as my personal tour guide and cultural interpreter, explaining Italian history and customs to me as if I hadn't been born in Italy and didn't speak fluent Italian. He'd read phrases from guidebooks in butchered pronunciation while I stood next to him, biting my tongue to avoid correcting his mistakes. Elena, did you know that the Colosseum was built almost 2,000 years ago, he'd say, reading from his phone while we stood in front of the ancient amphitheater where my grandfather had taken me as a child. That's fascinating, Kevin, I'd reply, not mentioning that I probably knew more about Roman history than his guidebook did. But the most infuriating part was how Kevin treated me around other people. In restaurants, he'd order for me without asking what I wanted. In museums, he'd answer questions that tour guides asked me directly. In shops, he'd negotiate prices as if I were incapable of handling simple transactions in my native language. Christina watched all of this happening and said nothing. When Kevin insisted on helping me down steps I could navigate perfectly well myself, she looked away. When he spoke for me in conversations with locals, she stayed silent. When he made decisions about our itinerary without consulting me, she offered no objection. My daughter had essentially decided that Kevin's assessment of my capabilities was more reliable than her own lifelong knowledge of who I was. She was treating me like an invalid because her husband had convinced her that's what I was becoming. But while Kevin was busy demonstrating his superiority over the helpless elderly woman he was shepherding through Europe, I was conducting business calls that would have blown his mind if he'd understood what he was hearing. Every morning, while Kevin and Christina slept late, I would wake up early and use the hotel's business center to handle my affairs back in Chicago. The time difference worked perfectly. I could have detailed conversations with James, Tony Santos, and my real estate agent, while Kevin and Christina thought I was just taking morning walks around the hotel. 3 days into our trip, while we were staying at a luxury hotel overlooking the Amalfi Coast, I had a crucial conference call with Tony Santos and our attorneys to finalize the restaurant acquisition. Elena, I have to say, this is the most unusual closing I've ever participated in, Tony said over the crystal-clear international connection. Most people don't buy restaurant companies while vacationing in Italy. Most people don't have sons-in-law who think they're incompetent, I replied. Tony, are you confident about the March 25th opening timeline for the first location? Absolutely. My team has been working around the clock to get everything ready. The renovations are ahead of schedule, the staff is hired and trained, and the marketing campaign launches next week. Santos Restaurant Group is going to make a big splash when you get back to Chicago. Perfect. And the press release announcing my role as CEO? Scheduled for March 30th, just like we discussed. Elena, the business media is going to be very interested in this story. A 70-year-old woman taking over as CEO of a restaurant company is unusual enough to generate significant coverage. That was exactly what I wanted. By the time Kevin and Christina returned from Europe expecting to find a helpless widow ready for institutional care, they'd instead find news articles about my appointment as chief executive of a multi-million-dollar company. Tony, I need you to do one more thing for me, I said. What's that? I want you to schedule a board meeting for April 5th. I want to invite my family to attend as observers so they can see how their incompetent mother and grandmother runs a business meeting. Tony laughed. Elena, I get the feeling there's a story behind this request. There's definitely a story, and it's going to have the most satisfying ending you can imagine. After I finished my business calls that morning, I returned to our hotel suite to find Kevin and Christina planning our day over breakfast on the terrace. Good morning, Elena, Kevin said with exaggerated cheer. How was your walk? Very refreshing. The morning air here is beautiful. I'm glad you're getting some exercise. It's important for people your age to stay active. Kevin's tone suggested that he was proud of himself for encouraging my mobility, as if I were a pet that needed training. Kevin, I've been walking for exercise since before you were born, I said mildly. I know. I just meant that it's good to see you taking care of yourself. Christina and I worry about you being isolated back home. There it was again, the constant implication that I was somehow failing to take proper care of myself and needed their supervision to function safely. Speaking of home, Christina said, speaking directly to me for the first time that morning, Kevin has been in touch with that real estate agent about listing your house. I set down my coffee cup carefully. What real estate agent? Kevin jumped in quickly. The one I told you about before we left. Marcia Collins from Premier Properties. She specializes in helping seniors transition to more manageable living situations. I don't remember agreeing to list my house. Well, we talked about it at Christmas, remember? We discussed how the house was becoming too much for you to handle, and how selling it would give you the resources to pay for assisted living. We talked about it, Kevin, but I never agreed to it. Christina looked uncomfortable but backed up her husband. Mom, you said you'd think about it. Kevin is just being proactive about getting information. Thinking about it and agreeing to it are two different things, I said firmly. Kevin's expression shifted from fake cheer to barely concealed irritation. Elena, we're trying to help you here. The housing market is really strong right now, and Marcia thinks your place could sell quickly for a good price. But we need to move fast to take advantage of current conditions. I haven't decided to sell my house. But Elena, you have to be realistic about this. You can't maintain that place forever, and the longer you wait, the more expensive the maintenance becomes. It makes sense to sell now while you can get top dollar and while you're still mentally sharp enough to handle the process. Still mentally sharp enough? Kevin had just revealed his real timeline. He thought my mental decline was imminent, and he wanted to complete his takeover of my assets before I became completely incompetent. Kevin, what exactly have you told this real estate agent about my situation? Just the truth. That you're an elderly widow who's realized that your current housing situation isn't sustainable, and that you want to explore your options. And what options did you tell her I was considering? Senior living communities, obviously. Places where you'd have support and wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep. Kevin had essentially put my house on the market without my permission, telling a real estate agent that I was an elderly woman who needed to sell quickly to fund institutional care. He'd probably even given her permission to show the property while we were out of the country. Kevin, I want you to call this real estate agent and tell her that I haven't decided to sell my house, and that she doesn't have permission to market it or show it to anyone. Elena, don't you think you're being a little hasty? We're just exploring options. No one is forcing you to do anything. Then why does this real estate agent think she has permission to list my house? Christina intervened, using the patient tone people use with children who are being unreasonable. Mom, Kevin is just trying to be helpful. He knows this is a big decision, and he wants to make sure you have all the information you need. I'll make my own decisions about my house, thank you. Kevin's patience was clearly wearing thin. Elena, I think you're getting upset about nothing. We're on a beautiful vacation in Italy, and you're worrying about real estate agents back in Chicago. Can't you just trust us to handle these details so you can focus on enjoying yourself? I can enjoy myself and still maintain control over my own property, Kevin. But that's exactly the problem. Kevin's voice was rising now, and his true feelings were starting to show. You're 70 years old, you live alone in a house that's too big for you, and you're trying to manage financial decisions that are getting more complicated every year. Christina and I are offering to help you, but you're being stubborn about accepting that help. I'm not being stubborn, Kevin. I'm being careful about making major life changes. Elena, there's a difference between being careful and being unrealistic. You can't live in that house forever. You can't drive forever. You can't manage complex financial decisions forever. At some point, you need to accept that you need help, and Christina and I are trying to provide that help. The mask was slipping. Kevin's frustration with my resistance to his plans was overwhelming his ability to maintain the pretense of caring concern. He was essentially telling me that I was too old and incompetent to make my own decisions, and that I should be grateful for his willingness to make those decisions for me. Kevin, I said quietly, what if I'm not as helpless as you think I am? What do you mean? What if I'm actually more capable of managing my own affairs than you realize? Kevin and Christina exchanged glances, and I saw something flicker between them. Impatience, frustration, maybe even anger that I wasn't cooperating with their plans. Elena, Kevin said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate, I think this conversation is getting too intense for a vacation. Why don't we just table all this financial stuff until we get home and focus on enjoying our time in Italy? I'm perfectly capable of having intense conversations, Kevin. My age doesn't make me fragile. I know you're not fragile, but this is supposed to be a relaxing trip. You're getting worked up over details that Christina and I can handle for you. There it was. The fundamental assumption that drove all of Kevin's behavior toward me. He genuinely believed that I was incapable of handling my own affairs, and that any resistance to his help was evidence of confusion or stubbornness rather than legitimate autonomy. The rest of that day was tense and uncomfortable. Kevin continued his role as tour guide, but with less enthusiasm and more obvious irritation when I showed any independence or expressed my own opinions about where we should go or what we should see. Christina remained largely silent, clearly uncomfortable with the conflict but unwilling to challenge Kevin's authority or defend my autonomy. That evening, while Kevin and Christina went to dinner at a restaurant he'd chosen without consulting me, I stayed in my hotel room and made another series of business calls. The first call was to James Morrison. Elena, how's the vacation going? About as well as expected. Kevin is treating me like an invalid, and he's apparently started marketing my house without my permission. He's what? He's been talking to real estate agents about listing my house while I'm out of the country. He thinks I'm too confused to notice or too weak to object. Elena, that's potentially illegal. He has no authority to make decisions about your property. I know. But James, it proves that everything we suspected about his intentions is true. He's not trying to help me. He's trying to control me. What do you want to do about it? I want to accelerate our timeline. How quickly can we close on the penthouse? The sellers are motivated, and you're paying cash. We could probably close by March 28th if you're willing to sign documents electronically. Do it. I want to own that penthouse before Kevin gets back to Chicago and discovers that his plans for my housing situation have become irrelevant. Consider it done. Elena, are you sure you want to move this quickly? James, Kevin is planning to sell my house and put me in assisted living without my consent. I think buying a $3 million penthouse is an appropriate response to his assumptions about my financial capabilities. My second call was to Tony Santos. Elena, how's Italy? Educational. Tony, I need you to move up our publicity timeline. What do you mean? I want the press release about my appointment as CEO to go out as soon as we return to Chicago. I want news interviews scheduled immediately. I want the business community to know about Santos Restaurant Group and my role in it before my family has time to process what's happened. That's ambitious, but we can make it happen. Elena, can I ask why the urgency? Because my family is planning to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized, and I want there to be extensive public documentation of my business competence before they get the chance. Tony was quiet for a moment. Elena, that's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Tony, when the press interviews me about my new role as CEO, I'm going to tell them exactly why a 70-year-old woman decided to take on the challenge of running a restaurant company. I'm going to explain that age discrimination and family manipulation motivated me to prove what I was really capable of accomplishing. That's going to be a powerful story. It's going to be the story that ends Kevin's ability to manipulate anyone ever again. My third call was to my attorney, Patricia Chen. No relation to my daughter, Christina, but a sharp estate planning lawyer who'd been helping me structure my assets for maximum protection and impact. Quote, Elena, I've been working on the revisions to your will that we discussed. How detailed do you want the explanations to be? Very detailed. I want Kevin and Christina to understand exactly why they're being excluded from my estate. And I want those reasons documented so clearly that no court would ever question my competence or my reasoning. I can definitely do that. Elena, have you considered the possibility that your family might challenge the will based on claims of undue influence or mental incapacity? That's exactly why I'm calling. Patricia, by the time this will is read, I want there to be extensive public documentation of my mental sharpness and business competence. I want newspaper articles about my role as CEO. I want business associates who can testify about my capability. I want a paper trail that makes any challenge to my competence look ridiculous. That's smart planning. Elena, what about provisions for your daughter? Even if you're angry with her now, she's still your only child. Christina has made her choice. She's decided that her husband's opinion of my capabilities is more reliable than her own lifelong knowledge of who I am. Patricia, I want Christina to inherit exactly what she deserves based on how she's treated me. And what's that? Nothing. I want her to inherit nothing, except the knowledge that her silence and complicity cost her the chance to benefit from everything I've built. Elena, that's a dramatic step. It's an appropriate response to a dramatic betrayal. After I finished my calls, I sat on my hotel balcony overlooking the Mediterranean and thought about how much my life was about to change. In 1 week, I would return to Chicago as the CEO of a restaurant company and the owner of a luxury penthouse. Kevin and Christina would discover that the helpless widow they'd tried to manipulate was actually one of the most financially successful women in the city. But more importantly, they would learn that there are consequences for underestimating people based on age, gender, or any other superficial characteristic. They would discover that treating someone like an incompetent invalid doesn't make them incompetent. It just makes them angry enough to prove you wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The next morning, Kevin knocked on my door at 7 a.m. Elena, we need to talk. About what? Single quote. I just got a call from Marcia Collins, the real estate agent. She says you called her yesterday and told her not to list your house. That's correct. Elena, we talked about this. We agreed that selling the house was the best option for your financial security. No, Kevin, you talked about it. I listened. There's a difference. Kevin's composure was cracking. Elena, you're being impossible about this. We're trying to help you make smart decisions about your future, but you're fighting us every step of the way. I'm making my own decisions about my future, Kevin. That's what competent adults do. But that's just it. You're not making smart decisions. You're being emotional and stubborn instead of practical and rational. Kevin, what makes you think you're more qualified than I am to make decisions about my life? Because I'm younger, I understand the current market conditions, and I'm not emotionally attached to a house that's become a financial burden. There it was. Kevin's fundamental belief that his youth made him more competent than my experience, that his assumptions about my situation were more reliable than my actual knowledge of my circumstances. Kevin, I said calmly, what if you're wrong about my financial situation? What do you mean? What if I'm not the struggling elderly widow you think I am? Kevin stared at me with a mixture of confusion and irritation. Elena, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the possibility that you've made assumptions about my capabilities and resources that aren't accurate. Elena, I know what your situation is. You're living on Social Security and a small pension. You own a house that's becoming expensive to maintain. You don't have substantial savings or investments. These aren't assumptions. These are facts. How do you know these facts, Kevin? Because it's obvious. Elena, you live modestly, you shop carefully, you drive an old car. You're clearly on a limited budget. And you think modest living automatically means limited resources? For someone in your situation, yes. What if my situation isn't what you think it is? Kevin was getting frustrated with my questions. Elena, what are you trying to say? That you have some secret fortune you've been hiding from your own family? I smiled at him, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. Quote, Kevin, when we get back to Chicago, I think you're going to be very surprised by what you learn about my actual situation. What's that supposed to mean? It means that this conversation about my incompetence and need for institutional care is about to become very interesting. Kevin stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out what I was implying. But his assumptions about my limitations were so ingrained that he couldn't imagine any scenario where I might have advantages he didn't know about. Elena, I think this vacation has been more stressful for you than we realized. Maybe we should consider cutting it short and heading home so you can get back to your routine. Actually, Kevin, I think we should extend our stay. I'm really enjoying Italy, and I have some business to finish here. Business? Elena, you don't have any business. I stood up and looked directly into Kevin's eyes. Kevin, you have no idea what kind of business I have. And in about a week, that ignorance is going to cost you everything you thought you were going to gain by manipulating me. I walked past him toward my hotel room, leaving him standing on the balcony with his mouth open, finally beginning to suspect that he might not know as much about his helpless elderly mother-in-law as he'd assumed. But Kevin still had no idea just how wrong he'd been about everything. And he was about to find out in the most shocking way possible. The final week of our European vacation was when Kevin's mask finally came off completely. My hints about having, quote, business to finish, and my refusal to cooperate with his real estate plans had clearly rattled him. And he was no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of being a caring son-in-law concerned about my welfare. We were staying in Paris at a 5-star hotel near the Champs-Élysées, and Kevin had spent the morning on the phone with various people back in Chicago, real estate agents, senior living facilities, and what sounded like attorneys based on the legal terminology I overheard. He was clearly trying to accelerate his timeline for taking control of my life, probably because my resistance was making him nervous about his ability to manipulate me successfully. That afternoon, as we sat in a cafe overlooking the Seine, Kevin decided it was time for ultimatums. Elena, we need to have a serious conversation about what's going to happen when we get back to Chicago, he said, setting down his coffee with the deliberate gesture of someone who is about to deliver important news. I'm listening, I replied, though I was actually composing an email to Tony Santos on my phone, finalizing details for the grand opening of our first restaurant location. Christina and I have been talking, and we've made some decisions about your living situation. We think this vacation has shown us that you're having more trouble with daily tasks than you want to admit, and we can't ignore that anymore. I looked up from my phone. What trouble with daily tasks? Elena, you got confused about the hotel room numbers twice this week. You had difficulty understanding the tour guide in the Louvre. You couldn't figure out how to use the Metro card. These aren't major problems individually, but together they show a pattern. Kevin was fabricating evidence of cognitive decline based on completely normal travel experiences. I'd been momentarily confused about room numbers because European hotels number floors differently than American ones. I'd had trouble with the tour guide because she was speaking rapid French with a heavy accent, not because I was cognitively impaired. I'd asked for help with the Metro card because I wanted to make sure I understood the system correctly, not because I was incapable of figuring it out. But Kevin was presenting these normal moments of uncertainty as proof that I was losing my mental faculties. Quote, Kevin, those are all perfectly normal experiences for anyone traveling in a foreign country. Maybe for someone younger, but Elena, at your age, these kinds of confusion episodes are warning signs. Christina and I can't ignore them anymore. Christina nodded reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict her husband. Mom, we're just worried about your safety. We want to make sure you have the support you need. What kind of support are you talking about? Kevin pulled out a folder of documents he'd apparently been carrying around for days, waiting for this moment. We've found the perfect solution. Sunset Gardens has an immediate opening in their assisted living section, and they're willing to hold it for you until we get back to Chicago. He spread brochures and contracts across the cafe table, as if we were conducting a business meeting rather than discussing my future without my consent. The monthly fee is $3,800, which we've calculated is exactly what you should get from selling your house after paying off any remaining debts and covering the real estate fees. Marcia Collins thinks your place should sell for around $400,000, which gives you enough for about 8 years of care, possibly longer if we invest the remaining proceeds wisely. Kevin had planned my entire future based on financial assumptions that were wildly incorrect, but he was presenting his calculations as if they were established facts rather than speculation. Kevin, I haven't agreed to sell my house or move to assisted living. Elena, we understand that this is difficult to accept, but sometimes families have to make hard decisions for people they love. You're not seeing the full picture of your situation, and it's our responsibility to make sure you're safe and cared for. Who decided it was your responsibility? We did, Kevin said bluntly. Christina is your only child, and I'm her husband. We're your family, and we're not going to stand by and watch you struggle alone when we can provide better alternatives. The audacity was breathtaking. Kevin had appointed himself as my guardian without any legal authority, and he was presenting his decisions about my life as family obligations rather than personal choices. What if I refuse? Kevin and Christina exchanged looks, and I saw something pass between them that made my blood run cold. They'd obviously discussed this scenario and prepared for my resistance. Elena, Kevin said carefully, we really hope it doesn't come to that. We want this to be a voluntary transition that we all feel good about. But if it's not voluntary? Christina spoke up for the first time in the conversation, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, we've consulted with an attorney about our options if you're not able to make rational decisions about your own care. There it was, the threat I'd been expecting but still shocked to hear. My own daughter was telling me that she and her husband had consulted lawyers about having me declared incompetent. What kind of options? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Kevin pulled out another document from his folder. In Illinois, family members can petition the court for guardianship when an elderly person is no longer capable of making sound decisions about their safety and welfare. We really don't want to go that route, Elena, but we will if we have to. On what grounds? The incidents we've documented over the past few months, the confusion about bills, the problems with daily tasks, the resistance to accepting help, the unrealistic assessment of your own capabilities. A judge would see a clear pattern of declining competence and family members trying to provide appropriate care. Kevin had been building a legal case against me for months, documenting every minor mistake or moment of confusion as evidence of mental decline. He'd probably been recording our conversations, taking notes on my behavior, and preparing testimony about my alleged incompetence. Kevin, you realize that having someone declared incompetent is a serious legal action with permanent consequences. Of course I realize that. Elena, do you think this is easy for us? Do you think we want to go to court and have lawyers involved in family decisions? We're trying to avoid all of that by finding a solution that works for everyone. By solution, you mean me agreeing to everything you've decided without my input. I mean you accepting that you need help and letting people who love you provide that help. Christina leaned forward, tears in her eyes. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We found a really nice place for you to live, we figured out how to pay for it, and we're offering to handle all the complicated details. All you have to do is trust us. Trust them. Christina wanted me to trust the people who had been planning my institutionalization behind my back, who had consulted attorneys about having me declared incompetent, who had been documenting my alleged failures for months in preparation for a legal battle. Christina, when did you stop believing that I was capable of making my own decisions? Mom, it's not that we don't believe in you, it's just that we can see things you can't see about your own situation. What things? Kevin interrupted impatiently. Elena, this circular conversation isn't helping anyone. We need a decision from you today about whether you're going to cooperate with this transition voluntarily or whether we need to pursue other options. You're giving me an ultimatum? We're giving you a choice. Accept our help willingly, or force us to get legal intervention to protect you from your own poor judgment. I looked at Kevin's face, flushed with righteous indignation, and at Christina's expression of tearful determination. They genuinely believed they were rescuing me from myself. They had convinced themselves that my resistance to their plans was evidence of incompetence rather than autonomy. How long do I have to decide? We need an answer by tomorrow morning, Kevin said. If you agree to the voluntary transition, we can start the paperwork immediately and have everything ready when we get back to Chicago. If you refuse, we'll file the guardianship petition as soon as we return. And if you file the petition? Then a judge will decide what's best for you, based on the evidence we present about your declining capabilities and need for supervised care. Kevin was confident that any judge would side with the concerned family members against the stubborn elderly woman. He probably assumed that courts routinely granted guardianship petitions from relatives who claimed to be protecting incompetent seniors. But Kevin had no idea that I'd been preparing for exactly this kind of legal challenge for months. I need some time to think about this, I said. Of course, Kevin replied magnanimously. Take all the time you need. But Elena, I want you to understand that we're doing this because we love you and want what's best for you. This isn't about money or convenience for us. It's about making sure you're safe and cared for. Kevin's ability to lie to himself was almost impressive. He'd convinced himself that his plan to control my assets and institutionalize me was motivated by love rather than greed, concern rather than manipulation. I understand, I said quietly. That evening, while Kevin and Christina went to dinner at yet another restaurant Kevin had chosen without consulting me, I made the most important phone calls of my life. My first call was to Patricia Chen, my attorney. Elena, how urgent is this? Extremely urgent. Kevin just gave me an ultimatum. Either I agree to move to assisted living voluntarily, or they're filing a guardianship petition when we get back to Chicago. On what grounds? I explained Kevin's documentation of my alleged cognitive decline, his claims about my financial incompetence, and his threats of legal action if I refused to cooperate. Elena, based on what you've told me, they don't have a strong case for guardianship. But guardianship proceedings can be expensive and emotionally traumatic even when the petitioner loses. Patricia, I want to make sure they can't succeed with this strategy, and I want to make sure there are consequences for them trying it. What do you have in mind? I want you to prepare documentation that proves my competence so thoroughly that any guardianship petition would be laughed out of court. Medical evaluations, financial records, business transactions, everything that demonstrates my mental acuity and sound judgment. That's smart defensive planning. What about offensive strategies? I want to explore legal action against Kevin for elder abuse, fraud, and any other charges that might apply to someone who threatens an elderly person with false guardianship petitions. Elena, that's a serious step. Are you sure you want to escalate to that level? Patricia, Kevin just threatened to have me declared incompetent and force me into institutional care based on fabricated evidence. I think serious steps are entirely appropriate. Understood. Elena, I'll start preparing everything immediately. How much time do we have? We return to Chicago in 3 days. I want documentation ready that will destroy any legal challenge they might attempt. My second call was to James Morrison. Elena, you sound stressed. Is everything all right? Everything is perfect, James. Kevin just showed his hand completely, and he has no idea what he's walking into. I explained the ultimatum and Kevin's threats of legal action. Quote, James, I want you to prepare a complete financial summary that shows not just my net worth, but my investment performance over the past 20 years. I want documentation that proves I've been making sophisticated financial decisions successfully for decades. I can have that ready by tomorrow. Elena, your investment track record is better than most professional money managers. Any court that reviewed your financial decisions would immediately recognize your competence. Perfect. James, there's something else I want to do. What's that? I want to liquidate some assets and put together a cash position that will shock Kevin when he discovers it. How much cash? $2 million. I want to have $2 million in immediately accessible funds when we get back to Chicago. Elena, that's a substantial cash position. What are you planning? I'm planning to demonstrate that the financially incompetent widow Kevin wants to control has resources he never imagined. My third call was to Tony Santos. Elena, you sound different. What's happening? I explained Kevin's ultimatum and threats. Tony, I need you to move our entire publicity timeline up by a week. I want the press release about my appointment as CEO to go out the day we return to Chicago. I want interviews scheduled immediately. I want the business community to know about Elena Castellano, CEO of Santos Restaurant Group, before Kevin has time to file any legal documents. That's aggressive timing, but we can make it happen. Elena, this is going to be a major story. A 70-year-old woman taking over as CEO while her family tries to have her declared incompetent? The media is going to love this angle. That's exactly what I want. Tony, when reporters ask me why I decided to become a CEO at age 70, I'm going to tell them about the son-in-law who called me useless and tried to have me institutionalized. Elena, that's going to generate enormous publicity for the company and for the issue of elder abuse. It's going to generate enormous consequences for Kevin and Christina. My fourth call was to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geriatrician who specialized in competency evaluations. Dr. Martinez, I need a comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluation that can be completed immediately when I return to Chicago. Mrs. Castellano, what's the urgency? I explained the situation. I see, Mrs. Brother need us. Castellano, I want to be clear that I can't guarantee the results of any evaluation, but based on our conversation, you sound completely lucid and competent. That's what I expect the evaluation to show. Dr. Martinez, how detailed can this assessment be? Very detailed. We can do comprehensive cognitive testing, psychological evaluation, memory assessment, decision-making analysis, everything needed to establish mental competence for legal purposes. Perfect. I want documentation so thorough that any judge would question the motives of people claiming I'm incompetent. My final call was to a private investigator who specialized in elder abuse cases. Mr. Rodriguez, I need you to investigate my son-in-law's financial situation and any history of similar behavior with other elderly family members. What kind of investigation? Kevin Martinez, age 34, works in car sales in Chicago. I want to know about his debts, his spending patterns, his employment history, and whether he's ever attempted to manipulate other elderly relatives for financial gain. Mrs. Castellano, that's a comprehensive background investigation. What are you planning to do with this information? I'm planning to use it to defend myself against false guardianship petitions and possibly to pursue criminal charges for elder abuse. How quickly do you need results? As quickly as possible. I'm expecting legal action from Kevin within days of returning to Chicago. After I finished my calls, I sat in my hotel room overlooking the lights of Paris and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete confidence in my ability to handle whatever Kevin and Christina threw at me. They thought they were dealing with a helpless elderly woman who could be intimidated into surrendering her independence. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd picked a fight with someone who had resources, allies, and determination they couldn't possibly imagine. But more importantly, they were about to learn that there are serious legal and financial consequences for threatening elderly people with false guardianship petitions. The next morning, Kevin knocked on my door at exactly 9 o'clock. Elena, we need your decision. I've made my decision, Kevin. And? I'm not moving to assisted living, I'm not selling my house, and I'm not accepting your management of my affairs. Kevin's face darkened. Elena, I was hoping you'd be more reasonable about this. I'm being completely reasonable. I'm a competent adult making my own decisions about my life. No, you're being stubborn and unrealistic. Elena, you're forcing us to take legal action to protect you from your own poor judgment. Kevin, you're welcome to file any legal petitions you think are appropriate. I'll see you in court. Elena, you don't understand what you're getting yourself into. Legal proceedings are complicated and expensive. You'll need attorneys, you'll need expert witnesses, you'll need to prove your competence to a judge who doesn't know you. Are you really prepared for that kind of battle? I smiled at Kevin with genuine warmth. Kevin, I think you're going to be very surprised by how prepared I am for that kind of battle. What's that supposed to mean? It means that when we get back to Chicago, you're going to discover that you've made some very serious miscalculations about my capabilities, my resources, and my willingness to fight people who try to manipulate me. Kevin stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out what I was implying. Elena, are you threatening me? Kevin, I'm informing you, when you file that guardianship petition, you're going to find out exactly who you're dealing with. And I don't think you're going to like what you discover. Elena, you're talking like you have some kind of secret weapon or something. I don't have a secret weapon, Kevin. I have multiple secret weapons. And you're about to experience all of them. Kevin's composure was starting to crack. Elena, what are you talking about? What secret weapons? You'll find out when we get home. Kevin, you've spent months underestimating me, planning my future without my consent, and threatening me with legal action based on fabricated evidence. Did it ever occur to you that someone who's lived 70 years might have learned a few things about protecting herself? Elena, you're starting to sound paranoid. This is exactly the kind of thinking that proves you need supervision. Kevin, paranoia is irrational fear. What I have is rational preparation for people who want to control my life for their own benefit. Elena, we want to control your life for your own benefit. No, Kevin, you want to control my assets for your benefit. There's a difference, and you're about to learn what that difference costs. Single quote. Kevin was getting agitated now, probably realizing that his intimidation tactics weren't working, and that I might actually be prepared to fight his legal challenges. Elena, let me be very clear about something. When we get back to Chicago, I'm filing a guardianship petition immediately. I'm going to present evidence of your declining mental capacity, your unrealistic assessment of your own situation, and your need for supervised care. A judge is going to look at a 70-year-old widow living alone versus concerned family members trying to provide appropriate care, and the decision is going to be obvious. Kevin, let me be equally clear about something. When you file that petition, I'm going to destroy you so completely that you'll wish you'd never heard my name. How, Elena, what could you possibly do that would have any impact on a legal proceeding? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city of light where I'd just spent a week executing business deals worth millions of dollars while Kevin thought I was a confused tourist. Kevin, when we get back to Chicago, you're going to discover that the helpless widow you've been manipulating is actually the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, the owner of a $3 million penthouse, and someone with enough resources and legal representation to fight you in ways you can't imagine. Kevin's mouth fell open. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that while you've been planning my institutionalization, I've been building an empire. While you've been documenting my alleged incompetence, I've been demonstrating my actual competence in ways that will shock everyone who thought they knew me. Elena, that's impossible. Kevin, the impossible thing would be a 70-year-old woman with no resources or allies successfully defending herself against your manipulation. What's actually going to happen is much more possible. You're going to discover that you picked a fight with someone who's been preparing for exactly this kind of battle for her entire adult life. Elena, I don't believe you. You're living on Social Security in a house you can barely afford. You don't have millions of dollars. You don't own companies. You're making this up to try to scare me. Single quote. Kevin, in 3 days, when we get back to Chicago, you're going to find out exactly what I own, exactly what I'm capable of, and exactly what happens to people who try to manipulate and control me. I walked past Kevin toward the door. Where are you going? I'm going to finish my business in Paris. I have some final arrangements to make before we return to Chicago and your education begins. Elena, wait. What business? What arrangements? I turned back to look at Kevin one last time before everything changed forever. Kevin, you called me a useless old relic who contributes nothing. Tomorrow, you're going to start learning what this useless old relic has actually been contributing while you weren't paying attention. I left Kevin standing in my hotel room, finally beginning to suspect that he might have made the biggest mistake of his life. But he still had no idea just how big that mistake was about to become. The flight back to Chicago was the longest 8 hours of my life, not because I was anxious about what was coming, but because I was so eager to begin Kevin's education about exactly who he'd been trying to manipulate for the past year. Kevin and Christina sat across the aisle from me in first class, whispering urgently about their legal strategy, and probably trying to figure out whether my confident threats in Paris had been real or just the desperate bluffs of a cornered elderly woman. They were about to find out. As our plane descended toward O'Hare Airport on that crisp April morning, I checked my phone for the final confirmations I'd been waiting for. James Morrison had texted that the penthouse closing had been completed and the keys were ready for pickup. Tony Santis had confirmed that the press release announcing my appointment as CEO would go live at noon. Patricia Chen had prepared a comprehensive legal defense package that would make any guardianship challenge look frivolous. Dr. Martinez had scheduled my competency evaluation for the following morning. Everything was in place for the most satisfying week of my life. Kevin was still operating under the assumption that he was dealing with a confused elderly woman who had gotten temporarily defiant during our vacation but would quickly fold when faced with real legal pressure. He had no idea that he was about to collide headfirst with a financial and legal steamroller that had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Elena, Kevin said as we waited for our luggage at baggage claim, I want you to know that it's not too late to reconsider your position. we can still work out a voluntary arrangement that avoids all the unpleasantness of court proceedings. Kevin, I've already reconsidered my position extensively. I'm very comfortable with the decisions I've made. Elena, you don't understand what you're facing. Guardianship proceedings are public. Your private affairs will be discussed in open court. Journalists might cover the case. Your neighbors will know that your own family had to petition for legal control over your life. Is that really what you want? Kevin was trying to intimidate me with the prospect of public scrutiny, completely unaware that I was about to seek out as much public attention as possible. The more people who knew about my situation, the better protected I would be from his manipulation attempts. Quote, Kevin, I'm not concerned about public scrutiny. In fact, I think public attention might be very educational for everyone involved. Christina finally spoke up, her voice strained with stress. Mom, please. This doesn't have to become a public spectacle. We're family. We should be able to work things out privately. Christina, you and Kevin made this a public matter when you decided to involve attorneys in court proceedings. I'm simply responding appropriately to the situation you've created. Mom, we haven't created any situation. We're just trying to help you make better decisions about your future. Christina, you've been conspiring with your husband to have me declared mentally incompetent. That's not help. That's betrayal. Christina's eyes filled with tears. Mom, that's not fair. We love you. We want what's best for you. Christina, if you loved me and wanted what was best for me, you would have asked me what I wanted instead of deciding what I needed. Kevin cut off our conversation by grabbing our luggage and heading toward the exit. Elena, we can discuss this more at home. Right now, let's just focus on getting settled and moving forward with practical arrangements. I won't be going home with you, Kevin. What do you mean? I mean, I have other arrangements for where I'll be staying. Kevin and Christina exchanged worried glances. This was obviously not part of their plan. They'd expected me to return to my house, where they could monitor my activities and maintain pressure for their assisted living solution. Elena, what other arrangements? Kevin asked. You'll find out soon enough. I pulled out my phone and called the car service I'd arranged to pick me up at the airport. This is Elena Castellano. I'm ready for pickup at Terminal 3, International Arrivals. Elena, what car service? Christina asked. We were going to drive you home. I told you, I have other arrangements. A black Lincoln pulled up to the curb, and a uniformed driver got out to help with my luggage. Kevin and Christina stood there with their mouths open, clearly not understanding how their confused elderly relative had arranged luxury transportation and was apparently going somewhere other than her house. Elena, where are you going? Kevin demanded. I'm going to my new home. Your new home? Elena, what are you talking about? Single quote, quote. I got into the back seat of the Lincoln and rolled down the window to speak to them one last time before everything changed. Kevin, Christina, I want you to go to my old house on Maple Street and take a good look around. Think about all the assumptions you've made about my life, my resources, and my capabilities. Then I want you to turn on the news at noon today and pay very close attention to the business segment. Elena, what's happening at noon? You'll find out. Kevin, Christina, enjoy the next few hours, because they're the last few hours you'll spend thinking you know anything about who I really am. I told the driver to take me to my new address, and we pulled away from the airport, leaving Kevin and Christina standing on the sidewalk looking completely bewildered. The drive to my new penthouse took 45 minutes in morning traffic, which gave me time to make the phone calls that would set the final stages of my plan in motion. My first call was to Tony Santos. Elena, welcome back to Chicago. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for months, Tony. Is everything set for the press release? Absolutely. At exactly noon, every major business publication in Chicago will receive our announcement about your appointment as CEO of Santos Restaurant Group. I've also scheduled interviews with the Tribune, the Sun-Times, and Chicago Business Journal for later this week. Perfect. Tony, make sure the press release includes my background as a successful investor and my role in building the company's financial strategy. I want it clear that this isn't some honorary position. I'm the actual chief executive making real business decisions. Already done. Elena, the angle about a 70-year-old woman taking on a CEO role is going to generate massive media interest. When reporters start digging into your background, they're going to find an incredible story of someone who's been hiding her business acumen for decades. That's exactly what I want them to find. My second call was to James Morrison. Elena, welcome home. Are you ready to shock some people? More than ready. James, did you prepare the financial summary I requested? It's sitting on my desk. Elena, when people see these numbers, they're gonna realize that you're not just wealthy. You're one of the most successful individual investors in the city. Your portfolio performance over the past 20 years is extraordinary. How extraordinary? Your average annual return has been 12.8%, which is better than most professional money managers. You've consistently outperformed market indices while maintaining a conservative risk profile. Elena, you're a financial genius who's been hiding in plain sight. James, I want you to schedule a meeting with Kevin and Christina for Thursday afternoon. Tell them you need to discuss my estate planning and financial management. What should I tell them the meeting is about? Tell them you're concerned about some recent irregularities in my decision-making and you want to review my competency to manage my own affairs. James laughed. Elena, they're gonna think you're proving their case about your declining mental capacity. Exactly. James, when they show up for that meeting expecting to discuss my incompetence, I want you to present them with the complete financial summary. I want to see their faces when they realize what they've been trying to control. This is going to be the most satisfying client meeting I've ever had. My third call was to Patricia Chen. Elena, I have everything ready for your legal defense. When Kevin files his guardianship petition, we're going to destroy him so thoroughly that he'll regret ever hearing the word incompetent. What do we have? Medical records showing perfect cognitive function, financial records proving sophisticated decision-making capabilities, business associates who can testify about your mental acuity, and a complete timeline of Kevin's manipulation attempts. Elena, if this case goes to court, Kevin is going to be humiliated. Patricia, I want to go beyond just defending myself. I want to explore criminal charges against Kevin for elder abuse and fraud. What kind of fraud? He's been making false representations about my mental state to third parties, including real estate agents and assisted living facilities. He's attempted to manipulate me into signing over control of my assets based on fabricated evidence of incompetence. That sounds like fraud to me. It sounds like fraud to me too. Elena, elder abuse prosecutors take these cases very seriously, especially when there's evidence of financial motivation. Good. Patricia, I want Kevin to understand that there are serious legal consequences for trying to manipulate elderly people. By the time we reached my new building, I felt like a general who had spent months preparing for battle and was finally ready to deploy her forces. Kevin and Christina thought they were dealing with a helpless victim, but they were actually facing someone with superior resources, better legal representation, and a comprehensive strategy for destroying anyone who tried to control her. The doorman at my new building greeted me like the VIP resident I was now going to be. Mrs. Castellano, welcome home. We have your keys ready, and the concierge has prepared an information package about building amenities and services. Thank you. Has my furniture delivery been scheduled? Yes, ma'am. Your designer will be here at 2 o'clock to oversee the installation, and everything should be ready by this evening. I had purchased the penthouse fully furnished with custom pieces selected by an interior designer who specialized in luxury residences. By tonight, I would be living in a home that cost more than Kevin thought I was worth in total. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor gave me a few moments to process what was about to happen. In less than 3 hours, Kevin and Christina would learn that the woman they'd been trying to manipulate was actually the CEO of a restaurant company and the owner of one of Chicago's most expensive residential properties. Their entire worldview was about to collapse. When the elevator doors opened directly into my penthouse foyer, I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with justice. This wasn't just a beautiful home. It was a symbol of everything Kevin had underestimated about my capabilities and resources. The penthouse was everything I'd hoped it would be. 3,000 square feet of elegant living space, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. A gourmet kitchen with commercial-grade appliances, a library with built-in bookcases, a master suite with a spa-like bathroom, and enough space to entertain dozens of people comfortably. But the most satisfying feature was the formal dining room with a conference table that could seat 12 people. This would be where I hosted the board meetings that would demonstrate my competence to anyone who still had doubts about my mental acuity. At exactly 11:30, I called Kevin's cell phone. Elena, where are you? We went to your house, but you're not there. I told you, Kevin, I'm at my new home. What new home? Elena, you don't have a new home. Kevin, turn on Channel 7 at noon and watch the business news. Elena, what does the business news have to do with where you're living? You'll understand in 30 minutes. Elena, this is ridiculous. Just tell me where you are so we can come pick you up and get this sorted out. Kevin, the sorting out is about to begin, but not in the way you expect. Watch the news at noon. I hung up and turned on my new 75-inch television, tuning to the local business news program that would be carrying the story about my appointment as CEO. At exactly 12 o'clock, the anchor announced the lead story. In an unusual move for the Chicago restaurant industry, Santos Restaurant Group has announced the appointment of 70-year-old Elena Castellano as Chief Executive Officer. Castellano, a longtime Chicago resident and experienced investor, will oversee the company's expansion plans and strategic development. The appointment is noteworthy both for Castellano's age and for her impressive background in financial management and business development. The screen showed a professional photograph of me that Tony's publicist had taken the week before we left for Europe, along with graphics displaying Santos Restaurant Group's projected revenues and expansion timeline. According to company founder Tony Santos, Castellano brings decades of investment experience and a proven track record of successful financial management to her new role. Santos Restaurant Group plans to open 3 new locations over the next 18 months, with Castellano overseeing all strategic and financial decisions. The anchor continued with details about my background, my role in the company's development, and the unusual nature of a septuagenarian taking on a CEO position in such a dynamic industry. Castellano will be available for interviews later this week to discuss her vision for Santos Restaurant Group and her perspective on leadership in the restaurant industry. My phone started ringing before the news segment was finished. Quote, Elena, what the hell is going on? Kevin's voice was shaking with shock and anger. I'm watching the business news, Kevin. Very interesting story about a new CEO appointment, don't you think? Elena, that can't be real. You can't be the CEO of a restaurant company. Why not, Kevin? Because you don't... Elena, you don't have the money to invest in restaurant companies? Don't I? Elena, we know your financial situation. You live on Social Security and a small pension. You don't have millions of dollars to invest in businesses. Kevin, you know what you've assumed about my financial situation. Apparently your assumptions were incorrect. Elena, this doesn't make sense. Where did you get the money for this investment? I've had the money for decades, Kevin. I just never mentioned it because I didn't think it was anyone else's business. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Kevin, are you still there? Elena, how much money do you have? Enough, Kevin. More than enough. Elena, I need specific numbers. How much money are we talking about? We're not talking about anything, Kevin. You're talking about my private financial affairs, which are none of your business. Elena, if you have significant assets, that changes everything about your care planning and living arrangements. Yes, Kevin, it does change everything. It changes everything about how you've been treating me, how you've been planning my future, and what you thought you were going to control. Elena, where are you right now? I'm at my new home. What new home? The penthouse I bought while you were planning my institutionalization. Another long silence. Elena, what penthouse? The $3 million penthouse I purchased with cash last week while you were busy documenting my alleged incompetence. $3 million? Elena, that's impossible. Kevin, nothing about this is impossible. The impossible thing would have been you successfully manipulating someone with my resources and legal representation. Elena, I don't understand what's happening. Kevin, what's happening is that you're learning the difference between what you assumed about me and what's actually true about me. Elena, we need to talk. We need to sit down and figure this out. Single quote, quote. We will talk, Kevin, but on my terms, in my time, and in ways that will be very educational for both you and Christina. What do you mean? I mean that your education about who I really am has just begun. Kevin, you called me a useless old relic who contributes nothing. Over the next few days, you're going to learn exactly what this useless old relic has been contributing while you weren't paying attention. I hung up and called James Morrison. James, Kevin just learned about my CEO appointment. He's starting to panic. I imagine he is. Elena, how do you want to handle the meeting with him and Christina on Thursday? I want it to be at my penthouse. I want them to see exactly what kind of home a financially incompetent elderly woman can afford. Elena, when they see your financial summary in that setting, they're going to realize they made the biggest mistake of their lives. That's exactly what I want them to realize. Over the next few hours, my phone rang constantly. Kevin called 6 times, Christina called 4 times, and even some distant relatives who'd seen the news coverage called to congratulate me on my CEO appointment and ask why they'd never known about my business activities. I didn't answer any of the calls. Kevin and Christina had spent months planning my future without including me in their discussions. Now they could spend a few days wondering about their own futures while I prepared the next phases of their education. That evening, as I sat in my new dining room overlooking the twinkling lights of Chicago, I reviewed the timeline for the week ahead. Tomorrow morning would be my competency evaluation with Dr. Martinez. Tuesday would be interviews with business reporters, who would document my mental acuity and professional capabilities. Wednesday would be the grand opening of our first restaurant location, where I would demonstrate my leadership skills in front of the business community. Thursday would be the meeting with James Morrison, where Kevin and Christina would learn the true extent of my wealth. And Friday would be the day I filed elder abuse charges against Kevin and initiated legal proceedings that would ensure he never tried to manipulate another elderly person. But the most satisfying part of the evening was the text message I received from my private investigator. Mrs. Castellano, preliminary investigation of Kevin Martinez reveals significant credit card debt, history of employment issues related to financial irregularities, and previous disputes with elderly relatives over inheritance matters. Full report will be available Tuesday. So Kevin had a pattern of financial manipulation and had apparently tried this strategy with other elderly family members. That information would be very useful when I pressed criminal charges against him. As I prepared for bed in my beautiful new home, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just one day. This morning, Kevin and Christina had thought they were returning to Chicago with the defeated elderly woman who would soon be under their control. Instead, they discovered that they were dealing with a CEO, a millionaire, and someone with the resources and determination to destroy anyone who tried to manipulate her. But they still didn't know the full extent of what they were facing. Tomorrow, they would begin to understand that underestimating Elena Castellano had been the biggest mistake of their lives, and that the consequences of that mistake would be more severe and more permanent than they could possibly imagine. The war was just beginning, and I intended to win it so decisively that Kevin would never again make the mistake of calling anyone a useless old relic. Because this particular old relic was about to show him exactly what happens when you try to manipulate someone who's been planning your destruction for longer than you've been planning her defeat. Tuesday morning began with the most satisfying competency evaluation of my life. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived at my penthouse at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying a briefcase full of psychological and cognitive assessment tools that would officially document what I'd known all along, that I was not only mentally competent, but intellectually superior to most people half my age. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was taking tests to prove my sanity in a $3 million penthouse, while the people questioning my competence were drowning in debt and scrambling to understand how their manipulation strategy had collapsed so spectacularly. Mrs. Castellano, Dr. Martinez said as she set up her materials on my dining room table, I have to say this is one of the more unusual competency evaluations I've conducted. Most people don't request these assessments voluntarily, and they certainly don't take them in homes like this. Dr. Martinez, I'm not most people. I'm someone whose family has threatened to have her declared incompetent, and I want ironclad documentation that those threats are baseless. The evaluation took 4 hours and covered every aspect of cognitive function imaginable: memory tests, problem-solving exercises, logical reasoning assessments, mathematical calculations, verbal comprehension, spatial relationships, and detailed analysis of my decision-making processes. Mrs. Castellano, Dr. Martinez said, as she packed up her materials, your cognitive function is not just normal for someone your age, it's superior. Your memory, reasoning ability, problem-solving skills, and judgment are all in the 95th percentile or higher. You scored better on these assessments than most 30-year-olds would. And your professional opinion about my competence to manage my own affairs. Mrs. Castellano, you're not just competent to manage your own affairs. You're exceptionally qualified to manage complex business and financial decisions. Anyone who questioned your mental capacity would have to ignore overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Perfect. Exactly what I needed to hear. My next appointment was with Jennifer Walsh, a business reporter from the Chicago Tribune, who'd requested an interview about my unusual transition from retired widow to restaurant company CEO. Mrs. Castellano, your story is one of the most interesting I've covered this year. It's not every day that a 70-year-old woman takes over as CEO of a growing company. Jennifer, please call me Elena, and I think you'll find that the story is even more interesting than you realize. Over the next hour, I told Jennifer the complete story. Kevin's condescending treatment, his assumptions about my poverty and incompetence, his threats of guardianship proceedings, his attempts to manipulate me into surrendering my independence and assets. Elena, this is an incredible story. You're telling me that while your family was planning to have you declared incompetent, you were actually executing multi-million-dollar business deals? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Jennifer. Elder abuse isn't just physical violence or obvious fraud. It's also manipulation, control, and dismissal of elderly people's autonomy, based on stereotypes and assumptions. And you decided to fight back by becoming a CEO? I decided to fight back by demonstrating my actual capabilities in the most public way possible. When people read about a 70-year-old CEO who's successfully managing a restaurant company, it challenges their assumptions about what elderly people are capable of achieving. That afternoon, I drove to the Santos Restaurant Group offices to meet with Tony and review preparations for tomorrow's grand opening. The restaurant offices were bustling with activity as staff prepared for the media event that would introduce Santos Restaurant Group to the Chicago dining scene. Elena, are you ready for tomorrow? Tony asked as we reviewed the guest list and media schedule. I've been ready for months, Tony. Tomorrow isn't just about opening a restaurant. It's about demonstrating that a 70-year-old woman can successfully lead a complex business operation. Wednesday morning brought the grand opening of Santos Restaurant Group's first location, and it was everything I'd hoped it would be. The restaurant was packed with food critics, business reporters, local politicians, and industry professionals, all eager to see what the septuagenarian CEO had accomplished. The highlight of the event was my presentation to the assembled guests about Santos Restaurant Group's mission and expansion plans. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share something personal with you today. 6 months ago, my own family tried to convince me that I was too old and incompetent to manage my own affairs. They wanted to put me in assisted living and take control of my assets because they assumed that a 70-year-old widow couldn't possibly understand complex financial and business decisions. The room went completely silent as people realized they were hearing something much more significant than a standard business presentation. Instead of accepting their assessment of my limitations, I decided to prove them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. I invested in this restaurant company, took on the role of CEO, and committed to demonstrating that age is not a barrier to business success when you have the knowledge, experience, and determination to succeed. The applause was thunderous. I could see people in the audience looking at each other with expressions of amazement and respect. Santos Restaurant Group will succeed because it's led by someone who understands that wisdom comes from experience, that patience comes from having navigated challenges before, and that determination comes from having something important to prove. We're not just serving food. We're serving notice that elderly people are capable of achieving remarkable things when they're given the opportunity and respect they deserve. As I finished my presentation, the entire room stood and applauded for almost 2 minutes. I could see tears in some people's eyes, and I knew that my message about ageism and capability had resonated powerfully. But the most satisfying part of the evening was the text message I received from my private investigator with his full report on Kevin's background. Mrs. Castellano, comprehensive investigation reveals pattern of financial manipulation targeting elderly relatives. Kevin attempted similar schemes with his grandmother, 2 great-aunts, and his ex-wife's grandfather. multiple complaints filed but never prosecuted. Also discovered significant gambling debts and history of employment terminations related to financial irregularities. So Kevin was a serial predator who specialized in manipulating elderly people for financial gain. This information would be devastating when I pressed criminal charges against him. Thursday morning arrived with a front-page business section article in the Chicago Tribune titled, 70 and CEO, How Family Manipulation Motivated a Business Triumph. Jennifer Walsh had written a comprehensive story that detailed my background, my family's manipulation attempts, and my decision to fight back by becoming a business executive. At exactly 2 o'clock, Kevin and Christina arrived at my penthouse for their meeting with James Morrison. When the elevator opened into my foyer, Kevin and Christina stepped out, looking like they'd been hit by a truck. The opulent surroundings, the panoramic views, the obvious expense of everything they saw, it all contradicted every assumption they'd made about my financial situation. Elena, Christina whispered, looking around in amazement, this place is incredible. When did you? Hello, Christina. Hello, Kevin. James is waiting for you in the dining room. James Morrison was seated at my conference table with a stack of financial documents that would destroy their understanding of my situation once and for all. Kevin, Christina, please have a seat. Elena has asked me to review her financial situation with you because of some concerns that have been raised about her competence to manage her own affairs. Kevin perked up, thinking that this meeting would support his arguments about my need for supervised care. Mr. Morrison, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. We've been very concerned about Elena's decision-making lately, and we want to make sure she has appropriate guidance for managing her finances. I see. Kevin, what specific concerns do you have about Elena's financial management? Well, she's been making some very unusual decisions lately. Taking on risky business investments, making expensive purchases, spending money in ways that don't seem sustainable for someone in her situation. Her situation? You know, an elderly widow living on Social Security and a small pension. We're worried that she's making financial decisions that could jeopardize her long-term security. James looked at Kevin with an expression of professional curiosity. Kevin, what makes you think Elena is living on Social Security and a small pension? Because that's her situation. She lives modestly, she shops carefully, she drives an older car. Obviously, she's on a limited budget. I see, Kevin, let me show you something. James opened the first file and spread my financial summary across the table. Quote, this is Elena's current financial position as of yesterday's close of business. Kevin and Christina leaned forward to look at the documents, and I watched their faces change as they processed the numbers. Elena's total net worth is currently $4.7 million, James continued calmly. Her investment portfolio has generated an average annual return of 12.8% over the past 20 years, consistently outperforming market indices while maintaining a conservative risk profile. Kevin's mouth fell open. Christina made a strangled sound. Elena owns her home free and clear, holds diversified investments across multiple sectors and geographies, and maintains substantial cash reserves for liquidity and opportunity investments. Her recent business investment in Santos Restaurant Group represents less than 15% of her total assets and falls well within appropriate risk parameters for someone with her financial profile. That's impossible, Kevin stammered. Kevin, I've been Elena's financial advisor for 15 years. I can assure you that these numbers are completely accurate. Elena is not only financially secure, she's one of the most successful individual investors I've ever worked with. Christina found her voice. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us about this? Christina, you never asked. You and Kevin made assumptions about my financial situation without ever inquiring about the reality. Kevin was frantically flipping through the financial documents, clearly trying to understand how his entire worldview had been wrong. Elena, if you have this much money, why do you live so modestly? Why do you shop with coupons? Why do you drive an old car? Kevin, I live modestly because I choose to, not because I have to. Wealth doesn't require conspicuous consumption, and frugality is a habit that helped me build this wealth in the first place. But Elena, if we'd known about your financial situation, we never would have suggested assisted living or selling your house. We thought you were struggling financially. Kevin, my financial situation doesn't change the fact that you tried to manipulate me into surrendering my independence based on false assumptions about my competence. You didn't suggest assisted living because you thought I needed financial help. You suggested it because you thought I was mentally incompetent. Single quote. James gathered up the financial documents and looked directly at Kevin. Kevin, I need to ask you something. Given Elena's demonstrated financial sophistication and successful investment track record, what made you think she was incompetent to manage her own affairs? Kevin couldn't answer. The question exposed the fundamental flaw in his manipulation strategy. He'd never actually assessed my competence. He'd simply assumed incompetence based on age and gender stereotypes. That evening, as Kevin and Christina left my penthouse in stunned silence, I made the phone calls that would complete Kevin's education about the consequences of manipulating elderly people. My first call was to Patricia Chen, my attorney. Patricia, it's time to file criminal charges against Kevin. I want him prosecuted for elder abuse, fraud, and any other charges that apply to his manipulation scheme. Elena, based on the evidence we've gathered, we can pursue multiple felony charges. Kevin's threats, his pattern of targeting elderly relatives, and his attempts to control your assets constitute serious criminal behavior. Good. Patricia, I also want to pursue civil remedies. I want Kevin to face financial consequences that ensure he never tries this manipulation strategy again. Elena, elder abuse civil cases often result in substantial damage awards. Given the scope of assets Kevin attempted to control, we could seek millions in damages. My second call was to Adia Maria Santos at the state's attorney's office. Ms. Santos, I'm ready to file formal charges against Kevin Martinez for elder abuse and fraud. I have extensive documentation of his manipulation attempts and evidence of similar schemes targeting other elderly relatives. Mrs. Castellano, your case represents exactly the kind of elder abuse prosecution our office prioritizes. Based on what you've described, we're prepared to pursue felony charges that could result in significant prison time. Friday morning brought the news I'd been waiting for. Kevin had been arrested at his workplace on multiple felony charges related to elder abuse and fraud. The Chicago Tribune's front-page headline read, "Local man charged with elder abuse after attempting to defraud millionaire mother-in-law." Single quote. The article detailed Kevin's arrest, the charges against him, and the scope of assets he'd attempted to control through manipulation and false guardianship threats. But the most devastating part of the coverage was the revelation of Kevin's pattern of targeting elderly relatives. Kevin Martinez, 34, has been charged with multiple felony counts related to his attempt to gain control of his mother-in-law's $4.7 million estate through false claims of mental incompetence, the article reported. Court documents reveal that Martinez threatened to have Elena Castellano declared legally incompetent unless she agreed to move to assisted living and surrender control of her assets. By Tuesday, the story had been picked up by national news outlets, social media platforms, and elder advocacy organizations. Kevin Martinez had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating elderly people and attempting to exploit family relationships for financial gain. Wednesday brought Kevin's arraignment hearing, which I attended to watch his public downfall. Kevin looked terrible as he stood before the judge. He'd lost weight, hadn't been sleeping, and was clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the legal consequences he was facing. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Patricia Williams said as she reviewed the charges, "you are accused of elder abuse, fraud, attempted theft by deception, and criminal conspiracy in connection with your alleged attempts to manipulate and control your mother-in-law's financial affairs. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Kevin said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Martinez, given the seriousness of these charges and the substantial assets involved, I'm setting bail at $50,000. You are also ordered to have no contact with the alleged victim or any members of her financial or legal team." $50,000 bail. Kevin, who was drowning in debt and had just lost his job due to the negative publicity, had no way to raise that kind of money. He would remain in jail until trial. As I left the courthouse, reporters surrounded me asking for comments about Kevin's arraignment. "I want people to understand that this case isn't about revenge," I told them. "It's about justice and protection. Kevin Martinez targeted me because he thought I was vulnerable and defenseless. He assumed that a 70-year-old widow would be easy to manipulate and control. This prosecution sends a message that elderly people have rights, resources, and allies who will defend them against family members who see them as opportunities rather than human beings. Thursday brought news that Christina had filed for divorce, citing Kevin's elder abuse as grounds for ending their marriage. The divorce papers included a statement from Christina that was both heartbreaking and vindicating. I have come to understand that my husband's treatment of my mother was not motivated by concern for her welfare, but by greed and a desire to control assets that were never his to control. I deeply regret my failure to defend my mother against his manipulation. Christina was finally speaking up for me, but it was too late to repair our relationship. Her silence during Kevin's manipulation campaign had cost her not just her marriage, but her inheritance and any future relationship with her mother. 6 months later, as I sat in my penthouse office reviewing the quarterly reports for Santos Restaurant Group, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by Kevin's attempt to manipulate me. The restaurant business was thriving beyond our most optimistic projections. We had opened 2 additional locations, hired over 100 employees, and generated more than $8 million in revenue during our first year of operation. But the professional success was only part of the transformation. I had become a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights and anti-abuse initiatives. I spoke at conferences, consulted with legislators about elder protection laws, and advised other elderly people who were facing family manipulation. The Montgomery Foundation for Elder Advocacy, which I had established with a substantial portion of my assets, was funding legal aid programs and support services in 12 states. Kevin Martinez had been convicted on all counts and sentenced to 3 years in prison plus 5 years of probation. The civil lawsuit had resulted in a judgment for $2.5 million in damages, ensuring that Kevin would spend the rest of his life paying for his attempt to manipulate me. Christina had lost any claim to my estate through her complicity in Kevin's schemes. My new will left the bulk of my assets to the Montgomery Foundation and to individuals who had shown me genuine respect and support. But the most satisfying part of the entire experience was the knowledge that Kevin's public humiliation and criminal conviction had protected other elderly people from similar schemes. 3 different elderly individuals had contacted me to report that family members had abandoned manipulation plans after reading about Kevin's prosecution. Several states had strengthened their elder abuse laws based on recommendations from cases like mine. As I finished reviewing the restaurant company's financial reports, my phone buzzed with a text message from Tony Santos. Elena, just got word that we've been selected as Chicago's Restaurant Company of the Year. The awards ceremony is next month, and they want you to give the keynote address about leadership and determination. I smiled as I typed my response. Tony, I'd be honored to speak about leadership and determination. I have some thoughts about what happens when people underestimate what elderly individuals are capable of accomplishing. That evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset over Lake Michigan, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Kevin's insults and manipulation attempts had been intended to diminish me, control me, and reduce me to a helpless victim dependent on his management. Instead, his attacks had motivated me to reveal capabilities I'd been hiding for decades, build businesses that generated millions of dollars in value, and create a legacy that would protect vulnerable elderly people for generations to come. 3 months later, I was featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as one of the most inspiring business leaders of the year. The headline read, "The CEO Who Turned Family Betrayal into Business Triumph, Elena Castellano's Story of Success After 70. In the article, I was quoted as saying, "Age discrimination and elder abuse don't just hurt individual victims. They waste the wisdom, experience, and capabilities of people who have spent decades learning how to solve problems and create value." My advice to anyone who thinks elderly people are automatically less capable than younger people is simple. Be very careful about your assumptions, because you might be wrong in ways that are more expensive than you can imagine. Single quote. The Forbes article generated thousands of responses from elderly readers who had been inspired by my story to pursue their own dreams, start their own businesses, and refuse to accept other people's limitations on their potential. But the response that meant the most to me came from a 92-year-old woman in Texas who wrote, "Dear Mrs. Castellano, my grandson tried to convince me that I was too old to manage my own finances and should let him take control of my assets. After reading your story, I told him that if a 70-year-old woman could become a CEO and expose family manipulation, then a 92-year-old woman could certainly handle her own bank account. Thank you for showing me that I don't have to accept other people's assessment of my limitations. That letter was worth more than all the business success, media coverage, and financial victories combined. Because ultimately Kevin's attempt to diminish me had ended up empowering thousands of other elderly people to stand up for themselves and refuse to be controlled by family members who saw them as opportunities rather than human beings. Kevin had called me a useless old relic who contributes nothing to the world. But the truth was exactly the opposite. I was Elena Castellano, CEO of a successful restaurant company, advocate for elder rights, and proof that age is just a number when you have the wisdom, resources, and determination to fight back against people who try to control your life. Kevin Martinez had learned, at enormous personal cost, that calling someone a useless old relic is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make, especially when that old relic has $4.7 million, a team of excellent attorneys, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The war was over, and I had won so decisively that Kevin would spend the rest of his life paying for the privilege of underestimating me. But more importantly, elderly people across the country were safer because Kevin's story had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of family manipulation and elder abuse. Sometimes the best revenge is living well and making sure that your victory protects other people from the same kind of treatment you endured. And sometimes, just sometimes, being called a useless old relic is exactly the motivation you need to prove that you're actually magnificent. Quote, as I prepared for bed in my beautiful penthouse that Kevin had never imagined I could afford, I reflected on the perfect justice of how everything had turned out. Kevin's attempt to manipulate and control me had backfired so spectacularly that it had created a national movement to protect elderly people from family exploitation. The useless old relic had turned out to be one of the most useful people in the fight against elder abuse and ageism. And Kevin Martinez would spend the rest of his life remembering the day he learned that calling someone useless can be the most useful lesson they ever receive, if it motivates them to prove exactly how wrong you are. Because this particular old relic was about to show him exactly what happens when you try to manipulate someone who's been planning your destruction for longer than you've been planning her defeat. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.